I had spent the last 10 years of my life building the perfect marriage. Or at least, that's what I thought. Alexander Sinclair was powerful, charming, and respected, the kind of man who could command a room with just a glance. And I had been the devoted wife, the poised and graceful woman standing beside him at every event, every meeting, every victory. Together, we were a power couple, the envy of high society. But all it took was one conversation, overheard by accident, to shatter the illusion completely. It happened the night before our 10th wedding anniversary gala, a grand event that was supposed to celebrate everything we had built together. I had been on my way to Alexander's office in our penthouse, intending to check on him before heading to bed. I wasn't even trying to be quiet. I had no reason to suspect anything. But then, as I neared the slightly open door, I heard my name. "Don't worry, babe. After the gala, I'll make the announcement. Isabel will be out of the picture soon enough." I froze. My heart pounded, the blood rushing in my ears. "Babe, announcement? Out of the picture?" My grip tightened on the doorframe as another voice, a woman's voice, laughed softly in response. "Are you sure she won't fight back?" That voice, I knew that voice. Vanessa Moore. She was one of Alexander's top business consultants, a rising star in corporate strategy, and someone I had personally welcomed into our inner circle. My stomach twisted. "Isabel?" Alexander scoffed, his tone dripping with arrogance. "She's completely devoted to me. She won't see it coming. Besides, by the time she realizes, the company will already be under my full control. The board trusts me. And when I introduce you, my future wife and the mother of my son, it'll seal the deal." My world went still. My breath caught in my throat. Mother of my son. My fingers went numb, my vision tunneling as the words echoed in my skull. Vanessa was pregnant. Not only had Alexander been having an affair, he was planning to replace me. It was surreal, standing there in the dim hallway, listening to my husband plot my erasure from my own life. I should have felt heartbreak, rage, devastation. But instead, I felt nothing. Or rather, I felt something colder, sharper. A terrible clarity settled over me. Alexander thought he had me figured out. Thought I was just his obedient, trusting wife, so deeply in love with him that I would never suspect, never fight back. He was wrong. I turned on my heel and walked away, my movements slow and deliberate. I didn't barge in, didn't scream, didn't let them know I had heard. No, that would be too easy. Instead, I let the rage settle into something more dangerous, a plan. Because Alexander had made a critical mistake. He underestimated me, and now he was the one who wouldn't see it coming. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my private study, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the cold determination in my eyes. The rage burned deep, but I refused to let it cloud my mind. This had to be strategic. It had to be precise. Alexander had spent years underestimating me, thinking I was just his trophy wife, graceful, intelligent enough to play the role, but not enough to be a real threat. He had no idea that I had been watching him for years. I pulled up the company's financials, accessing the private accounts I had long ago learned to keep an eye on. There it was. The discrepancies were subtle, expertly disguised under shell companies and offshore accounts. But I had always been meticulous. Alexander had been siphoning money out of Sinclair Enterprises for months. He wasn't just planning to leave me. He was planning to leave me with nothing. I exhaled slowly, my pulse steady. It should have broken me. It should have left me gasping on the floor, sobbing into the silk of my robe. But instead, I felt an icy calm settle over me. He thought he was playing chess. He didn't realize I had already been playing a different game entirely. By dawn, my plan was in motion. I called my legal team, my forensic accountant, and the private investigator I had hired months ago when I first suspected something was off. I didn't give them all the details, only what they needed to know. Time was running out and I had to move quickly, because tonight was the anniversary gala, and tonight I would take back everything he thought he had stolen from me. The Sterling Grand Hotel was glowing with elegance when I arrived. Chandeliers glittered overhead, the polished marble floors reflecting the golden light, and the air buzzed with the conversations of New York's elite. Everyone who mattered in the business world was here. CEOs, investors, politicians, journalists. Perfect. Alexander was already there, standing at the center of the ballroom like a king holding court. He was dressed in a custom midnight blue tuxedo, his trademark charming smile plastered across his face as he entertained guests. But I knew him better than they did. That smile was his greatest mask. I watched as Vanessa appeared beside him, her form-hugging emerald dress emphasizing the undeniable curve of her pregnant belly. She stayed a few steps behind him, hesitant, uncertain. She thought she was winning. She had no idea she was walking into the beginning of her downfall. The moment Alexander saw me, his expression shifted, just barely, just for a fraction of a second. Doubt, suspicion. Good. I smiled at him, radiating warmth, my posture composed. I was the epitome of the devoted wife, unshaken, untouched. He needed to believe I was still blind, still unsuspecting. "Darling," I said smoothly, pressing a kiss to his cheek. His muscles stiffened under my touch. "What a wonderful evening." "Isabel," he said cautiously, searching my face, "you look stunning." I did. I had made sure of it. My sapphire gown draped over me like liquid silk, diamonds glittering at my throat, my confidence more powerful than any jewelry I wore. "Shall we get started?" I murmured, my fingers brushing lightly over his wrist. He had no idea. The stage was set, and in just a few minutes, his world would come crashing down. The night was in full swing, laughter and champagne bubbling through the air, but I could feel the tension humming beneath the surface. It was a tension only Alexander and I truly understood. He had been watching me since I arrived, his gaze flickering between me and the guests, searching for something, some clue as to why I wasn't broken, why I wasn't devastated. He expected rage. He expected a confrontation. He had no idea what was coming. I moved through the crowd effortlessly, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries. It was easy, this game of pretense. I had played it for years, standing beside my husband, watching him charm, deceive, manipulate. But tonight, the mask would crack. As I took my place at the grand banquet table, I caught Vanessa's eye across the room. She hesitated, uncertainty flickering in her expression. Good. She was starting to feel it. That nagging sensation in her gut, the one that whispered something was wrong. She wasn't wrong. As the final course was being served, I gently tapped my champagne flute with a fork, the delicate chime cutting through the air. The conversations around us dwindled, and all eyes turned toward me. Smiling, I rose from my seat, my hands steady, my heart hammering in my chest, but not with fear, with anticipation. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice smooth, poised. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate another successful year for Sinclair Enterprises." I turned to Alexander, letting my gaze linger on him for just a second too long. And, of course, to honor the man who made it all possible. A smattering of applause followed, and Alexander lifted his glass in acknowledgement, his confidence flickering back to life. Fool. I inhaled slowly before continuing, my next words slicing through the air like a blade. "But before we raise our glasses, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge something truly special, something that, until recently, I had no idea was happening right under my nose. I let the silence stretch, the anticipation thick, electric. Alexander's jaw tightened. I recently learned that my husband, the brilliant Alexander Sinclair, has been making some rather interesting business decisions. The shift in the room was immediate, heads turning, whispers beginning. Alexander set down his glass, his smile frozen in place. "Isabel," he said smoothly, but I raised a hand, silencing him with nothing but a look. "And not just business," I continued, my voice dripping with something dangerously close to amusement. "Personal ones, too. In fact, they've been so impactful that I believe this is the perfect time to share the news." I turned my gaze toward Vanessa. She stiffened. She knew now. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, lifting my glass, "allow me to introduce you to Miss Vanessa Chen and the child she is expecting, my husband's child." The silence was deafening. Vanessa paled. Alexander's carefully curated composure shattered in real time. The crowd, composed of some of the most influential figures in the city, erupted in hushed, scandalized murmurs. And then, before Alexander could speak, before Vanessa could scramble for an excuse, before the lies could even form, I struck the final blow. "Oh, and one more thing," I said lightly, reaching into my clutch and pulling out a thin envelope. "Since we're all here tonight, I figured this was as good a time as any to present Alexander with a parting gift." I tossed the envelope onto the table in front of him. He didn't move. "It's over, darling," I whispered, just loud enough for only him to hear. "And I've made sure you have nothing left." He reached for the envelope with slow, trembling fingers. When he pulled out the contents, bank records, fraud documentation, legal notices, I saw it. The exact moment he realized he had lost everything. And I smiled.
The moment Alexander pulled the documents from the envelope, I watched as the blood drained from his face. His hands trembled slightly, his usually steady fingers gripping the paper as if hoping to crush the truth out of existence. But the truth was indestructible now. Around us, the room had spiraled into stunned silence. Some guests exchanged wary glances, while others pretended to sip their champagne, eager to witness the unfolding disaster without appearing too invested. No one wanted to miss this. Alexander cleared his throat, forcing a tight smile as he turned toward me. "Isabel," he murmured, his voice so low that only I could hear, "what have you done?" I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. "Oh, just a little housekeeping, darling. It turns out when you're married to someone for over a decade, you learn all their secrets." Vanessa, sitting just 2 seats away, was frozen in place. Her complexion had turned an ashen gray, her breath shallow. She glanced at Alexander, waiting for an explanation, a lifeline, anything that might salvage the wreckage. But there was nothing left to salvage. The weight of the betrayal was crashing down on her, just as it had on me not long ago. The difference? I had prepared for this moment. She hadn't. Alexander finally found his voice, though it lacked its usual confidence. "This is a misunderstanding," he announced, his voice just loud enough to carry over the murmuring crowd. He forced out a chuckle, though it landed flat. "My wife is clearly emotional. Let's not let a private disagreement ruin the evening." I laughed softly, not out of amusement, but out of sheer disbelief at his audacity. "Emotional?" I repeated, tapping my fingers against the pristine white tablecloth. "Alexander, sweetheart, let's be honest with our guests, shall we? You weren't expecting this, were you?" He turned to me, jaw clenched. "I don't know what you think you know." "Oh, I know plenty," I interrupted, reaching for another envelope from my clutch and tossing it in front of him. "Shall we review?" Alexander hesitated. He knew this wasn't just a game anymore. Harold Winters, one of the board members and a man who had been a mentor to Alexander for years, leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he examined the papers. "What exactly am I looking at here?" he asked. his voice calm but laced with suspicion. I smiled at him. That, Harold, is a detailed breakdown of Alexander's recent financial activities. Offshore accounts, shell companies, millions siphoned from Sinclair Enterprises without board approval. It's all there. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The board members sitting at the table immediately straightened, exchanging alarmed glances. They understood the implications. Harold flipped through the documents with increasing speed, his expression growing darker with each page. "Alexander," he said slowly, his voice dangerously low, "tell me this isn't true." Alexander didn't respond. He couldn't. Vanessa let out a sharp breath. "Wait," she said, voice shaking. "What does this have to do with me?" I turned to her, and for the first time that evening, I softened slightly. "Vanessa," I said gently, "did you really think you were the future of Sinclair Enterprises? That Alexander planned to build a life with you and your child?" Her lips parted, but no words came out. I sighed. "He wasn't preparing for a new life with you, darling. He was preparing an escape, a new identity, a future that didn't involve either of us." Vanessa flinched as if I had struck her. "You're lying," she whispered. But she didn't sound convinced. I leaned forward. "Then ask him yourself." All eyes turned to Alexander. For the first time in his life, he had no words. I settled back into my chair, lifting my champagne flute in a silent toast. "To the truth," I murmured. And then I drank as Alexander's world burned around him. Alexander's silence was deafening. His carefully crafted empire, built on deception and arrogance, was crumbling right before his eyes. His fingers clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles white as the blood drained from his face. For the first time in his life, he had no control. The murmurs around the table grew louder. Board members whispered among themselves, some pulling out their phones, likely already forwarding the documents to their legal teams. The wolves were circling. Vanessa, still dazed, turned to Alexander. "Tell them it's not true," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me this isn't happening." Alexander exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if trying to will the truth away. "Vanessa, He stopped, realizing that no explanation could undo what had just been revealed. His betrayal was laid bare, undeniable, and in front of the very people he had spent years trying to impress. "Enough," I said, my voice calm but firm. "The time for excuses is over." I turned my gaze to Harold Winters, the most influential member of the board. "Harold, I assume you and the other board members will be meeting first thing in the morning to discuss Alexander's termination?" Harold, still flipping through the damning financial records, nodded stiffly. "There's nothing to discuss. He's finished." Alexander's head snapped toward him. "You can't just—" "We can," Harold interrupted, his voice as sharp as steel. "You didn't just betray your wife, Sinclair. You betrayed this company. Your greed and recklessness could have destroyed everything we've built. You're out." The weight of Harold's words hit like a sledgehammer. Alexander's mask of confidence finally cracked, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes I never thought I would: fear. Vanessa, still visibly shaken, pushed her chair back, standing on unsteady legs. "I was supposed to be part of your future," she whispered, her voice hollow. "You told me we were building something together." Alexander turned to her, desperate now. "Vanessa, I never meant for it to be like this. You lied to me," she snapped, her voice breaking. "I gave up everything because I believed in you. I thought—" She shook her head, letting out a bitter laugh. "I thought I was different. That you actually loved me." I watched her carefully, seeing the realization settle in. She had been nothing more than a pawn to him, just like I had been, once. "You're on your own," she said, her voice trembling, "and I hope you rot for what you've done." Alexander flinched as if she had slapped him. Vanessa turned to me, her expression unreadable. "I don't expect your forgiveness," she said, "but thank you for telling me the truth." I nodded, offering nothing more. We were never meant to be allies, but in that moment, we understood each other. As Vanessa walked out of the room, the reality of Alexander's downfall set in. The board members stood one by one, some shaking their heads, others offering me quiet nods of acknowledgement. Harold was the last to stand. He turned to me and said, "We'll be in touch, Isabel." And then, just like that, everyone was gone. Alexander and I were the only two left in the grand dining room, now eerily quiet. The weight of his disgrace sat heavy in the air between us. I stood, adjusting my dress, and leaned in close to him. "You underestimated me," I whispered. "That was your biggest mistake." His eyes burned with fury and humiliation, but there was nothing he could do. With one last glance at the man who had once controlled my life, I turned and walked away. And this time, I wasn't looking back.
The door clicked shut behind me, sealing Alexander in the ruins of his own making. I walked down the dimly lit hallway of the Sterling Grand, my heels clicking against the marble floor, each step steady, deliberate. For years, I had walked in his shadow. Tonight, I walked away from it forever. The elevator doors opened, revealing Vanessa standing inside. Her arms were wrapped protectively around her stomach, her eyes still glassy from the realization of Alexander's betrayal. I stepped in beside her, and the door slid shut, enclosing us in heavy silence. "I never thought it would end like this," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned to her, studying her expression, pain, anger, but most of all, regret. I could have been cruel, told her that she had been foolish for believing in him, but the truth was, I had once believed in him too. "You'll be fine," I said instead. "You and your child, you don't need him." She let out a shaky breath. "And you." I looked at my reflection in the mirrored walls of the elevator. The woman staring back at me was no longer the naive wife who had once believed in fairy tales. She was stronger, sharper, completely in control. I've never been better. The elevator chimed as we reached the lobby. A team of lawyers was waiting for me just outside, along with a few members of the board who had stayed behind to finalize Alexander's removal. But before I stepped out, Vanessa reached for my arm. "I don't want his money," she said. "I just want my son to have a future that's not tainted by him." I nodded. "That's something I can help with." She swallowed hard, and then, with one last glance toward the floor above where Alexander still sat, she walked away, out of his life. I stepped outside, where the crisp night air greeted me like a promise. The city lights stretched before me, glittering, endless. It was all mine now. A car was waiting for me. As I slid into the back seat, my lawyer, David, handed me a thick folder. "It's done," he said. "The board has formally voted to remove Alexander as CEO. The asset freeze is in place. As of tomorrow morning, his name will be wiped from every legal document tied to Sterling Industries." I exhaled slowly, letting the words sink in. I had done it. David hesitated before continuing. "There's one more thing. Alexander's lawyers have reached out. He's asking for a meeting." I let out a quiet laugh. "Now? He wants to talk?" David gave me a measured look. "He's desperate. He's trying to negotiate." I stared out the window as the car pulled away from the hotel. The thought of seeing Alexander again, of hearing him try to justify his actions, should have filled me with rage. But instead, all I felt was indifference. "Tell them my answer is no," I said finally. "Alexander made his choices. Now he gets to live with them." David nodded. "And the divorce proceedings?" I turned away from the window, my lips curving into a satisfied smile. "Push them through. I want everything finalized within a month." As the city blurred past, I thought about everything I had lost and everything I had gained. I had walked into that dinner expecting a war, but I had left with an empire. Alexander had spent years trying to mold me into the perfect wife, the silent supporter in the background. He never realized that I was the one who had been watching, learning, waiting. Now, the throne was mine, and I had no intention of giving it back. The lesson and the next chapter. As I stepped into my new office, the weight of the past lifted from my shoulders. The sterling name no longer belonged to Alexander. It belonged to me, to the future I was building, a future based on integrity, not deception. It had taken years of silence, of playing my role perfectly. But in the end, I had won not just the battle, but the war. The lesson? Betrayal doesn't break you, it reveals you. It shows you who you are when the mask is ripped away. For years, I had been the devoted wife, the woman who stood by her husband's side while he made decisions that shaped an empire. But the moment he decided I was disposable, I made sure he was the one left with nothing. Strength isn't about holding on to something broken. Strength is knowing when to walk away and when to take everything with you. For those watching, what would you have done in my position? Would you have walked away quietly? Or would you have fought for what was rightfully yours? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story of power, betrayal, and ultimate revenge, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the Men's Cheating Story channel so you never miss the next part. More incredible stories are coming your way. Stories of women who refused to be played, who turned the tables, and who walked away not just victorious, but unstoppable. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join our community. Because in the end, the best revenge isn't just winning, it's thriving. Until next time.